Chapter 14. The words of the young soldier hung in the air like the persistent fog that enveloped the cliffs of Aodhgall at dawn. "It comes from Cradmer," he said, and the name resonated in the chamber like an ill omen, bringing with it the taste of salt and the memory of broken oaths. Aodhgall extended his hand without looking at the boy, who awkwardly advanced through the smoke and time-worn tapestries. The castle, like him, seemed a wounded animal that stood upright by sheer will. Its ancient stone walls exhaled dampness, and the windows, narrow as sores in the rock, let in a wind that smelled of burned peat and moss. As Aodhgall unfolded the letter, Dòrnait stayed near the hearth in the shadows, her fingers still clenched around the seams of her dress. The ashes in the fireplace pulsed like a sleeping heart. The heat she had felt moments before was starting to fade, leaving behind a knot of emotions she didn't know how to name. The laird read in silence, his brow furrowed, his jaw tight like a taut rope. With every line, his face grew harder, until the passion of moments before seemed to have never existed. In its place stood the warrior, the strategist, the warlord. Dòrnait watched him as if seeing him for the first time. Aodhgall MacCraith, Lord of Ardgour, was no longer the man who had kissed her with the hunger of centuries, as though his mouth could summon ancient pacts sealed in blood. He was the son of a land where betrayals grew like ferns between stones, and where oaths were as fragile as snowflakes falling on the Celtic crosses scattered across the hills. "What news do they bring from Cradmer?" Dòrnait asked in a low voice, dragged down by the gravity of the moment. He took a while to answer. He folded the parchment with almost ritual precision, as if it contained a prophecy, and tucked it into the hem of his kilt. "The old lion awakens. He has summoned the clans. The Lord of Cradmer has landed in Skye. They want war," he said at last without looking at her. The word war seemed to awaken the ancient spirits that lived in the castle's walls. The wind howled through the cracks like the lament of a being nigh, the death omen that washed blood-stained clothes by the streams. Dòrnait felt a chill, as if someone had stepped upon her undug grave. He turned toward her, and his eyes were now as cold as the waters of the Sound of Aodhgall. The warmth that had enveloped her moments before had extinguished. Aodhgall now wore the mask of the tribal chief, the one who showed no weakness, who did not hesitate. But Dòrnait, still trembling from the contact of his tongue on her skin, knew that beneath that stone armor something else beat. "You should rest, girl. The coming storm doesn't forgive those who hesitate." His voice was firm, but she sensed the crack. A tiny hesitation, like the vibration of a string stretched to the point of breaking. Was it for her? Or was it something deeper, something older? She straightened up, smoothing her skirt slowly. The courage she had inherited from her lineage flared in her blood. "I'm not a child you can dismiss with kind words, Aodhgall. I've lived in court among wolves disguised as lambs. I know what power means. And I also know when a man wants to protect something he doesn't dare name." A shadow crossed his features, fleeting as the flutter of a raven over the battlements. "And what do you think I'm trying to protect?" he asked, as if the answer could change the destiny that lay ahead. Dòrnait looked him in the eyes. In them she saw the reflection of the flame, dancing like a spirit trapped between two worlds. Her world. And his. "Yourself," she said firmly. "From what you might come to feel." In that instant, the silence was more powerful than any word. From the depths of the castle, a deep murmur echoed, as if the very stones held the secrets of ancient druids and the forgotten prayers of hermit monks. A lightning bolt crossed the sky beyond the narrow stained-glass windows, and the thunder arrived with the slowness of the inevitable. Aodhgall approached the window and looked westward. Beyond the heather-covered hills, beyond the lochs where the fates slept beneath the water, Duart loomed like a distant threat, an echo of his childhood and his condemnation. "They'll come before the solstice," he murmured. Dòrnait stepped closer, feeling how the tension still unrelieved between them crackled in the air. "Then," she said, her voice as serene as a saint's prayer on the eve of martyrdom, "prepare to face them. And I will too. Because you're not the only one who has something to protect." Aodhgall slowly turned his face toward her. For a moment the laird vanished, and only the man remained. The one who had longed to kiss her, until their souls fused. The one who perhaps could no longer do so without betraying everything he had sworn to defend. Distant footsteps echoed in the gallery. Duty called. But something invisible, deeper than flesh, older than blood, had been born between them. A pact without words. Forged in desire. And in fire. Chapter 15. Uranie was moved by the storm of emotions flickering across her brother's face, but before she could ask another question, a sharp knock echoed on the door. 3 dry knocks. A pause. Then one more, barely a whisper against the heavy oak. "Who the hell?" Aodhgall murmured, moving quickly toward the door, his brow furrowed. When he opened it, the Scottish night mist slipped through the crack like a cold breath from the city, bringing with it the scent of damp peat and low tide. Before him, hunched and covered in a mud-streaked cloak, stood Vardran, the old watchman. His weathered face, mottled with moss and age, seemed even more worn by the urgency that brought him. "My laird," said Vardran, bowing his head. "News from the northern hills. From the Balhitter forest. Something has awakened." Aodhgall's eyes narrowed. "What is it?" Vardran lifted his gaze. His look was glassy, frightened, as if he had stared too long beyond the veil that separates this world from the next. "A black horse without a rider, with seaweed for mane and eyes of fire, crossed the ford of Kaya. The old women of the village say it's the Ichuiski, the one who drags men into the lake to devour their souls." Uranie stepped back quickly, crossing herself. "Are you sure?" "I saw it with my own eyes. It left no footprints on the ground, but wherever it stepped the grass withered. And on the riverbank." Vardran swallowed, pulling a crumpled piece of cloth from his pouch. "I found this." Aodhgall took it. It was a shred of tunic, a deep red, like dried blood. He recognized it immediately. "It's from the men of Cradmer," he said gravely. A chilling silence settled between them. "Do you think Terbert has summoned that?" Uranie whispered, as if fearing that speaking the word might give it power. Aodhgall shook his head, but his jaw tightened. "Terbert plays with fire. Always has. But this is older than him. Older than all of us." His words echoed like an ancient prayer. "If the Ichuiski has been seen in our lands, it means the veils between worlds are weakening. And if it comes from the north, it might not only bring death but a message." "A message from whom?" Uranie asked, whispering, as if afraid to wake something sleeping among the castle stones. Vardran did not answer. He only looked up at the battlements, where a flock of crows had settled in complete silence, like omens of a fate already sealed. Aodhgall closed the door with a dull thud and looked at his sister. "I must speak with Dòrnait." Uranie asked no more. She had grown up in these lands, and knew when the air was thick with omens. Deep down, like all children of the north, she believed that beneath the skin of the visible world forces moved that no one could control. Aodhgall climbed the stone stairs 2 at a time, the cloth still in his hand like a banner of warning. The castle seemed to breathe as he ascended. The walls exhaled dampness and the wind howled through the cracks like ancient voices speaking in forgotten tongues. When he reached Dòrnait's door, he stopped. He didn't know what he was going to say. Only that he had to see her. That he had to explain, not with words, but with what still lingered between them, that the world was more dangerous than she believed, that he couldn't let her go because something dark had awakened and carried her name between its teeth. He knocked. Once. Twice. Nothing. The door was not locked. He pushed it slowly, and the sound of rusty hinges was like a lament. But Dòrnait was not inside. Aodhgall's heart plunged into the void. "Dòrnait," he called softly, almost afraid to break the silence. Only the howl of the wind answered him, which, as if mocking him, carried a woman's voice that wasn't really there. But he knew what it meant. She was gone. And if she had left alone, on a night like this, with the Ichuiski loose, God help them. He ran toward the battlements as Vardran and Urani followed, and from the heights with eyes sharpened by desperation, he spotted a female figure riding a dark horse descending the cliff path. But the horse was not hers. It left no footprints. And its mane was made of seaweed. No! Aodhgall shouted, feeling the air freeze in his lungs. Dòrnait. Because now he understood what that apparition meant. The Echuiski had not come to kill. It had come to claim. And it had come for her. Chapter 16. The mist smelled of salt, of rotting seaweed and ancient secrets. It coiled around Dòrnait like a living creature, a remnant of the old Celtic world that refused to die. The Hebridean Sea whispered verses in Gaelic as it broke gently against the rocks, as if the spirits of the Druids still lingered in the cracks of that wild, solitary landscape. The boat waited, stranded on the damp sand like a sleeping animal, dark and light, its interior strewn with forgotten nets and traces of salt. It was a fisherman's boat, without sail or emblem, and its virtue lay in its simplicity. With trembling hands, Dòrnait pushed the hull into the water, feeling the cold gnaw at her skin through her petticoats. Every step toward the sea was a break from everything she had been, daughter of a clan, pawn in alliances, sacrificed sister. Behind her the castle's towers barely rose through the fog, its battlements like stone teeth jutting toward the sky. It was a solid, angular structure, standing on the hill as if born from the rock itself. The gargoyles on the cornices, barely visible, seemed to watch her depart. Once the castle might have meant shelter. Now it was only prison and betrayal. The air was thick with omen. A raven cawed somewhere, invisible in the mist, and Dòrnait shivered. In her childhood tales, her grandmother spoke of Morrigan's raven, the goddess of war and fate. They said where the raven flew, change followed, and blood was never far behind. She didn't look back. The water reached her knees. She clambered into the boat awkwardly, and sat in the rower's position. Her hands, cold but resolute, gripped the worn wooden oars. Each stroke broke the mirror of mist on the sea, and the coast began to blur behind her, as if night itself was closing in to hide her. The oars splashed in a steady rhythm, and at last, reaching open water, Dòrnait lifted her eyes to the sky. There was no moon that night, only a pale glow behind low clouds, like the dimmed light of an abandoned altar. She thought of Saint Columba, who crossed these same waters centuries ago, braving mists and sea beasts to bring the gospel to Iona. She was no saint, no apostle, but something like faith burned in her chest, a desperate faith in freedom. A shadow moved between the waves. Dòrnait stopped. Just a fish, perhaps, or an illusion conjured by fatigue and anxiety. Still she whispered a prayer, blending Latin learned from her nurse with old Celtic words calling on the protection of Brigid, patron of hearth and courage. She felt all forces, Christian and pagan, were with her. Or at least, she wanted to believe so. Sky was already rising before her, dark and majestic. The hills seemed to breathe, covered in heather and silence. But there were also cliffs, hidden reefs beneath the foam, and the whirlpool sailors called the gates of the otherworld. There, according to legend, wandering souls could be lost forever. But she was not a wandering soul. Not yet. A wave jolted her violently. She gripped the sides of the boat and kept rowing. She was soaked, exhausted, and yet something new was beginning to form within her. It wasn't hope. It was something denser, harder. Like the steel of a well-forged dagger. Like the knowledge that she was no longer the girl who let herself be kissed and promised sweet things. She was, at last, the author of her own story. And if the price of that freedom was to venture alone into a sea of mist and darkness, she would pay it without hesitation. The sea opened before her like a gray scroll, vast and unknown, stretching beneath a moonless sky. The mist, thick as sheep's milk, floated over the surface with an almost living unease, as if it held ancient spirits whispering from the veil of the otherworld. On those western shores where waves had battered rocks since before the clans, the night had a voice of its own, and that voice murmured in Gaelic. Dòrnait rowed with the resolve of someone fleeing not just a place, but a part of herself. Each stroke was a challenge to her limits, each pull of the oar a silent prayer. The hollow sound of wood slicing through water, the creaking of the boat, the wind in her frozen ears, all of it echoed the past. She knew the sea, like God, made no distinction between the just and the damned. Her mind, stirred by fatigue and fear, sought refuge in the sacred. She crossed herself clumsily, with hands as cold as the stones of the ancient Kilmartin cairn, and whispered a pater noster. The prayer, learned from her mother's lips when she still slept with rag dolls under the covers, brought her comfort. But then she remembered the tales Celia's used to tell by the hearth, stories of the selkies that lured maidens from the waves, of the Naclavi, the skinless demon who rode the coast, and of the Beannai, the washers of the dead who scrubbed bloody shrouds by the rivers when death was near. Dòrnait clenched her teeth and kept rowing. The icy water bit at her ankles. A tangle of seaweed brushed her fingers, and sparked a superstitious shiver. They weren't just plants, she thought. In that part of Scotland, anything might carry a soul. What if she had disturbed a sea spirit when she set off? What if the Lament MacCuinn, the sea maiden, her forgotten childhood reflection, had come now to claim her? The sea seemed infinitely vast, but now and then, through breaks in the mist, Dòrnait caught sight of sky's blurred silhouette, an island crowned by violet shadows, mountains lying still beneath a blanket of heather. It was beautiful, silent, immense, and still so far. The distance wasn't just physical, it was also the span between her and the girl she had been, the young woman who believed in sweet promises, the prisoner who had become a woman. She thought of Aodhgall. She hated him for making her trust. She hated him even more for not forcing her to stay. The sea, as her mother had taught her, had memory. It remembered the names of the drowned, the broken oaths, the secrets lovers whispered into the foam. Would it remember Dòrnait too? Or would she be just another intruder, a woman fleeing along the edge of the world? The boat tilted suddenly, and a splash of salt water struck her face. She froze, staring into the dark waters, wondering what creature had brushed the hull. Then she heard it. It wasn't the wind. It was a lament. Low, resonant, like an ancient chant dragged from the deep. It had no words, but it carried sorrow. It was the sound of a heart breaking under the weight of goodbye. Dòrnait sat motionless, lips parted, as if that echo had risen from within her own chest. The mist seemed to part for a moment, and turning she saw him. Aodhgall, standing on the spur of the cliff, his cloak billowing like a motionless raven in the night. He held a torch, and though the distance was great, Dòrnait felt the sting of his gaze pierce her skin. He didn't shout. He didn't call. He only watched her. Perhaps it was only an illusion, born of fear and exhaustion. Perhaps the sea, with all its memory and magic, was playing one last trick on her. She didn't look away. In that moment, something inside her broke and wove itself back together, like a taut thread of wool that snaps and is knotted again, stronger, rougher. Love was not a cloak one shed in the rain. It was a mark, like the ash cross worn on the forehead on Ash Wednesday. Bid dia mael Ryan, she murmured. May God be with me. She gripped the oars again, her muscles burning with exhaustion, her eyes dry, no tears left. Sky awaited. And beyond it, the world. The boat kept moving, slow but unyielding, cutting through a sea heavy with legends and broken vows, as the first light of dawn began to stain the horizon with a pale shimmer of hope. Dòrnait, inner voice. What if what I feared most wasn't being a prisoner, but being loved without any defense? What if this love, so close to the soul that it burns, was more terrifying than any stone cell? I have fled from many things, from pacts, from brothers, from clans. But maybe I wasn't running from them, but from myself, from my deepest longing, from the wound that screams every time someone touches me gently. Sometimes I want to run, not because he hurts me, but because he sees me. Because in his eyes I am neither shield nor sacrifice. I am just me. And that leaves me exposed. Chapter 17. The sea mist spread over the land like a blessing or a curse, slow and thick, as if the ancient gods had descended from the cairns to wrap the world in their breath. The air smelled of salt, damp peat, and omen. The darkness was not complete. In the sky, stars twinkled through ragged clouds like ancient eyes watching everything. And amid that landscape of liquid shadows, a rider galloped tirelessly, his cloak billowing like a black wing over the animal's back, his heart pounding like a war drum. Aodhgall felt anguish creeping inside him like a dark fern. Each gallop of his horse on the wet earth seemed to silence the clamoring in his chest, but did not stop it. Dòrnait. Dòrnait was slipping through his fingers like water. And this time, he could lose her forever. He passed by a half-buried dolmen hidden by centuries of weeds, a sacred stone where the elders said, druids whispered to the dead, and the Tuathla Cambrach danced on moonless nights. Those lands were full of stories. Of souls that never slept. And of brave women who drowned in the mist without anyone hearing their cries. The vision struck him like lightning. Dòrnait alone in that old boat, water soaking her to the bone, the night swallowing her whole. He remembered her expression when he last saw her, that mix of wounded pride and a sadness he hadn't read in time. He also remembered what they had told him about the lake in Inverary, the day the girl still living inside her had felt death clutch her ankles. And now she was back on the water. The cliff descending to the beach emerged from the fog like a sleeping beast. The descent was steep, but he barely noticed. Guided by a force that was not just his own, he moved down like a man going to meet his fate. There it was, the beach. Deserted, white as bone under the faint moonlight. And there too, barely a shadow among shadows, a boat bobbing clumsily in the dark seawater. Small. Too small to withstand the current of those shores. His eyes narrowed. The figure was barely visible, but it was there. Huddled, tense, the oars beating a trembling rhythm against the waves. Dòrnait. For a moment, everything stopped. Time hung suspended between the waves and the wind. The world became a whisper, as if the ancient gods had withdrawn to watch what was to come. Without thinking, without even shouting, he began running toward the water. He stripped off his cloak and boots in a rough gesture, and threw himself into the sea as if he could swim to her, if he had to. Dòrnait. His voice finally roared like a highland storm thunder. Dòrnait. The boat wavered. It rocked. For a second, he thought it was going to capsize. But the figure turned toward him. And even in the dark he saw her eyes. Large, frightened. Filled with that ancient mixture of defiance and fear. "Come back," he shouted, more pleading than commanding. "You can't do this alone." She didn't answer. But the oar dropped. And the boat slowly turned in the water, shaken by a treacherous current. Night closed over Dòrnait like a tar shroud. Around her, the Hebridean sea heaved with a deep, ancient rhythm, like the chest of a sleeping or furious god. The boat creaked beneath her, protesting in its skeleton of wood rotted by years' salt and neglect. An invisible hole in the hull let the sea in as if claiming it for itself, as if Nectan, the Celtic god of deep waters, was awakening from his slumber, hungry for human blood. The water, cold as dagger steel, already reached her waist. The current, thick with seaweed and phosphorescent foam, brushed her skin with fingers that felt like claws. Dòrnait trembled, but not just from the cold. It was fear, deep and alive, pressing down on her chest. The fear of dying without having truly lived, without fully understanding why she had thrown herself into this impossible flight. The boat rocked like a coffin on the tide, sinking a little more with each sway. Dòrnait had tried to row, but the oars were heavy and her arms numb. So she bailed water with her hands, again and again, as if she could empty the ocean with the force of her stubbornness. But for every cup of water she threw out, 3 more poured in through the invisible crack. On the shore, the outline of Glean rose like a promise through the mist, its silhouette sketched in charcoal against a canvas of clouds. The castle torches flickered like will-o'-the-wisps, dancing flames in the damp fog. In that glow she recognized the face of hope, the echo of something familiar. A heartbeat of life. And then she saw it. An orange dot, moving with purpose. A rider. The flicker of a torch waving to the rhythm of the gallop. Her heart skipped a beat. Aodhgall. "Here," she shouted with all the strength left in her, her throat rough from the mist and salt. "I'm here." But her voice was swallowed by the sea, devoured by the wind roaring in from the west like the voice of the ancients. The rider was a shadow blurring and fading away. Dòrnait shouted again, until her breath splintered. Then the light disappeared, swallowed by the hill. And with it, her last hope. The silence that followed was worse than the roar. A dense silence that weighed on her like a tombstone. Dòrnait felt the warmth leave her completely. The water reached her chest. Her fingers were blue. Around her, the darkness thickened like ink. She barely made out the horizon line. It was no longer night. It was the end of the world. She leaned on the side of the boat and forced herself to keep going. To bail more water, even though she could hardly move her hands. She did it by instinct. By stubbornness. By a final spark of life. In the distance, the roar of the sea seemed to blend with another sound, deeper and stranger. Like a voice rising from the depths of the waters. A banshee, she thought for a moment, her mind confused. The mournful voice of a spirit announcing death. But no, it was not a banshee. It was the howl of the wind. Or at least, that's what she wanted to believe. "My God," she whispered in a fading voice, like a shipwrecked prayer. "If you're there, help me." The name of God and the ancient gods floated together in her mind, entwined like vines. Saint Columba and Kaya, the winter witch. Saint Mungo and the Kelpies. Her childhood in the highlands had taught her that both worlds coexisted, like the layers of the sea. And then, as the boat suddenly lurched and the water slapped her face like an icy blow, she saw a figure on the cliff. This time it wasn't light. It was form. A dark rider, his profile cut sharp against the fog as if born from a legend. His cloak fluttered in the wind like raven wings. Dòrnait didn't dare move, afraid to break the spell. The rider raised an arm. He recognized her. She screamed, but this time it was a scream of pure hope. The man dismounted and ran toward the shore, leaving the horse behind as if it weighed nothing, as if it were flying. Dòrnait didn't know how, but she knew it was him. That he had come back for her. And then, as if the sea itself understood that its prey was about to escape, the boat tipped sharply, and the water engulfed her completely. Dòrnait sank with a muffled scream, while the darkness of the sea wrapped her like a shroud. But she also felt a hand. Strong, determined. Searching for her among the waves. Aodhgall. Aodhgall threw himself into the sea without a second thought. The water was an icy spear that bit his skin and stole his breath. But he swam with the strength of ancient warriors, driven by something stronger than fear, a love he hadn't realized he felt until that moment. A love that consumed him with the violence of a wildfire on the moor. When he reached the boat, he grabbed one of the edges, gasping for air. Dòrnait was frozen, her lips purple, her fingers still clutching the wood as if it were her only salvation. And for a moment that felt endless, they said nothing. They just looked at each other. "Why?" she finally said, her voice broken. "Because I won't let you slip away," he answered. "Not again." The sea kept whispering around them. Maybe they were voices. Maybe it was God. Maybe the sea maidens, the mighty Mara watching them from the depths, jealous of the love they could never have. Aodhgall climbed into the boat with effort. He sat facing her, trembling, soaked, his eyes glowing like embers. "You can't run from me, Dòrnait. Not if your soul is already walking beside mine." She began to cry. And for the first time, she didn't try to hide her tears. Above them, the moon broke through the clouds. And the sea turned to liquid silver. The boat, small and fragile, floated like a symbol of their fate, fragile but alive. Their souls united by a storm of fire and water. And the night finally wrapped around them. Silent. Sacred. Like a blessing fallen from the heavens, or a prophecy woven by the hands of the ancient gods. Chapter 18. The fortress, blackened by centuries of damp and the Atlantic salt spray, seemed to stand more alive than ever beneath the whistle of the wind tearing through the battlements. The storm that had been brewing in the belly of the sea now roared with restrained fury. Dense dark clouds curled around the nearby mountain peaks, where the mist clung like an old spirit to ancient stones. The castle's gargoyles, twisted sentinels carved in forgotten times, seemed to watch the scene with empty eyes, as if recognizing in Dòrnait something more than mortal flesh, a creature between worlds touched by death yet unclaimed. Aodhgall crossed the threshold with Dòrnait's lifeless body in his arms, soaked and trembling, as if the weight of the sea still clung to his bones. Water dripped from his cloak, spreading across the hall's stones like a trail carrying echoes of what had just happened. His face, carved by urgency, admitted no questions. His eyes were two dark wells where not even the torchlight's fire could reflect. He climbed the stone stairs, ignoring the whispers behind him, Roisel's pleas, Urani's exclamations. Nothing existed outside of her. His Dòrnait. Hers not by right or promise, but by a fate older than the castle itself, deeper than the blood spilled in the clan's name. A bond forged where the dreams of druids meet the will of saints. A mystery as old as Celtic legends, where souls joined before bodies, and wills were tied in eternity. He carried her to her chambers, a tall austere room whose walls exhaled the scent of moss and ash. Beneath a splayed window letting in a thread of wind, the bed stretched like an altar. The fire crackled in the stone hearth, but it was not enough. Dòrnait was all ice. Aodhgall laid her on the covers, trembling hands removing her wet clothes. There was no lust in his movements, only urgency, only faith. He wrapped her in thick woolen blankets, brought burning braziers, filled the room with warm steam. Roisiel hurried to place herbs steeping. Angelica root, heather flower, and myrrh from northern monasteries, mixed by Urani with an old Gaelic prayer learned from her grandmother, said to protect the soul from the Aodhgall gate. "Give her this if you can," whispered Roisiel, making Dòrnait swallow a few drops. She didn't react. "She's trapped," murmured Urani, pressing a palm to her forehead as if reading her spirit. "She's halfway between this world and the next. If you don't claim her soon, she won't return." Aodhgall fell to his knees beside the bed, resting his forehead on the blanket covering her body. He had thought he knew fear, but this was something older, fiercer. It was as if the Lady of the Lake had taken her forever to her realm of shadows and stars. As if the Morrigan, the crow goddess, had spread her wings over Dòrnait. "Not you," he whispered, hoarse and trembling. "Not you, Dòrnait. Don't do this to me." The fire sparked, bursting in the air like an incandescent tear. The rain hit the window panes like a lament. Then he saw her shudder. A slight spasm ran through her body, as if an invisible breeze had passed through her. Then a sigh, weak, broken, almost imperceptible, escaped her lips. Her eyelids fluttered. Her eyes half opened, still clouded, searching for light. Dòrnait's gaze lifted to his, and in that instant everything else vanished. She spoke no word. She couldn't. But Aodhgall saw what he needed, recognition, the spark, consciousness. She was alive. Returning. From the dark depths of the ocean, from the edge of the world, from the boundary between life and death, she was coming back to him. She raised a trembling hand, as if reaching for something beyond the tangible, barely touching his face. He covered it with his, pressing her against his skin. A sob escaped his throat. He did not allow himself fully. Not yet. But his eyes were wet. The fierce laird, the warrior forged in iron and duty, was trembling. "Shish," he whispered, pressing his forehead against hers. "I've got you. You're with me now." Outside, the howling wind carried a strange sound. A wail. An ancient moan rising from the cliffs, as if the spirits of the place were celebrating or mourning the return of a soul. The sound of stone and water, of time and pain. The echo of banshees, the elders said, when a life hangs by a thread as thin as a wet hair. But Aodhgall did not fear them. Not now. Because Dòrnait was breathing. Because her soul had not been taken from him. And while the night continued outside, and the castle nestled among the crags like a sleeping giant, he stayed by her side, watching over her. Whispering prayers he didn't know he knew. Words mixed from Latin and Gaelic, from his Christian mother and his Druid grandmother. Words that wove a protective circle around her, like in the old legends. The battle was not over. But for this night, death had been defeated. Chapter 19. He would not only gain a wife but also the favor of the Earl, lands that would strengthen his position against Duart, and most importantly his brother's freedom. But now, in the silence of his chamber, as the faint light of dawn began to filter through the cracks in the thick curtains, that decision weighed on him like a stone submerged in his chest. Dòrnait lay beside him, barely breathing, wrapped in his warmth and his guilt. He had agreed to marry her, as one accepts a sharp sword at the throat. Not to love her. Not to cherish her. Only to save another. And yet there she was. Her body still trembling from the effort to breathe again, from being torn from the arms of a sea that seemed to have wanted to swallow her whole. Through the poorly shut window the ocean's murmur came in whispers, carrying with every wave something from the old world, as if the gods of ancient Scotland, Manannán mac Lir, lord of seas and winds, wanted to claim her for themselves. The fire crackled softly. The black stone of the hearth cast golden reflections on the walls covered with worn tapestries. An old Celtic cross carved in wood stood above the headboard, half hidden in shadows. He looked at it with silent fury. What kind of god allowed such cruelty? But he also knew from his mother's stories that fate wove its threads with contradictions, like the Moirai of the old world or the holy martyrs of the new. And Dòrnait. Dòrnait was no soulless pawn on his board. She never had been. She stirred slightly. Her lips parted in a faint sigh, and Aodhgall felt her settle deeper against him. Her hand, small and finely warm, now clutched his chest with renewed strength, as if something inside her, still unconscious, was responding to the warmth he offered. "Dòrnait," he murmured, barely a breath. She didn't answer, but her breathing grew steadier. The trembling he had felt beneath his fingers began to fade. Aodhgall closed his eyes for a moment, finally allowing himself to breathe. In his mind the image of Aodhgall rose again, his red cup as if stained with blood, his viperous gaze, his smile like a knife. What right did he have to use Dòrnait as a bargaining chip? What kind of man was he to accept that game? But this was not the time to undo bargains. Not now. Not while she still walked the threshold between life and death. Outside, the wind howled through the stone towers of the castle, making the wood creak and the weather vanes groan as if the spirits of the sea, furious at having lost her, had surrounded Cradmer demanding their due. The elders said the castle had been built on a knot of power, a crossing between what was and what should not be remembered. And tonight, Aodhgall could almost believe it. Because Dòrnait, with her hair like beaten gold threads, with her lips still tinged blue, did not seem entirely mortal in his arms. She seemed torn from legend. Like Deirdre, doomed by desire. Like Saint Brigid, devoted to fire. He held her tighter. When morning came and she awoke, she would have to face the truth. She would have to decide whether to continue the lie, or give him the secret she had hidden beneath her oath to Aodhgall. Because if he had learned anything during that sleepless night, it was this: he didn't want to protect Dòrnait out of duty. He wanted to protect her like a promise. He wanted for the first time to belong not to a clan nor to a cause, but to her. Aodhgall, inner voice. I've fought men. I've faced storms. But no sword can shield me from the gaze of a woman who neither fears me nor desires me for power. A woman who expects truth, not dominion. What if fate wasn't the curse of a dying crone, but the ancient fear of surrendering without conditions? What if loving was the greatest act of courage ever asked of me as a chieftain? I thought offering her my name would be enough. But what she demands is that I tear out my soul and place it in her hands, and still choose to stay. That is the real battle. Chapter 20. The dim light of the chamber, barely broken by the flickering fire in the hearth, seemed suspended in time. The castle's stone walls whispered ancient secrets, and the sea wind, distant yet constant, echoed like a ritual chant through the fortress cracks. In that silence heavy with omens, Aodhgall's question sliced the air like a blade forged in the furnace of distrust. "What more do you want?" he asked in a low voice, making no effort to hide the shadow of suspicion darkening his features. The Earl of Aodhgall smiled, and on his lips lingered a cunning as old as the hills. He was not a man easily offended, least of all when distrust had been rightfully earned. "Your cooperation," he replied calmly. Aodhgall didn't bother to feign surprise. He knew Aodhgall spoke on the king's behalf, seeking to enlist him for royal interests. But after his brother's unjust imprisonment, his loyalty to James VI was as fragile as frost beneath the Beltane sun. Still, he also knew that alliances, like the old gods of the forest, could offer shelter if invoked correctly. "My quarrel has never been with the king," he said at last, measuring each word like a stone shaped to fit an ancestral wall. "It's with Terbert. The king turned his face away, left me without support. If you are willing to back me not only in freeing my brother, but in reclaiming my castle, then, and only then, I'll have no reason to oppose the crown." Aodhgall raised his brows, like a druid surprised by an acolyte's boldness. "You bargain while your brother remains in chains." Aodhgall narrowed his eyes, his voice turning sharp as the claws of Morrigan's crow. "You're playing too. You send your cousin to marry Finlaiche as swiftly as a lord casts dice on Samhain. Don't preach virtue to me." He paused, weighing the effect of his words. "I'll marry whoever I must, for my brother. But I won't do it from a place of weakness." Aodhgall studied him with shadowed eyes, as if peering through the veils of what lay ahead. At last he nodded, sealing the pact with a subtle movement, no blood oath but no less dangerous for it. "Done," he said solemnly. "But know this, you will not harm her. Dòrnait may be a wild spirit, and her tongue sharp, but I will not allow her to suffer. If you force her, you'll lose my support, and more than just my respect. And my brother. On the day of the wedding, when I'm certain Dòrnait has given her consent, he will be freed." Thus the deal was sealed, like a vow spoken between the Christian God and the old ones of the Barrows. A pact with the devil himself could not have been more poisoned. Aodhgall accepted it without emotion. In exchange for his brother and his land, marrying the earl's niece seemed a small price. But he did not yet know the true weight of that coin. When he returned to his chambers, he found her asleep, as if surrendered to fate. The crackling fire wrapped the room in a warmth that felt almost sacred. Dòrnait lay on the bed, her face turned toward him, wearing an expression of such pure peace it pained him to look at her. The sea roared in the distance, like an ancient guardian who never sleeps, and the wind carried the salty scent and the echo of stories reaching back to the days of Cernunnos. She opened her eyes slowly, blue as the sky over Iona, and for a moment she looked at him with no barriers, no masks. An innocent surrender shimmered in her gaze, and something within him beyond desire trembled. Longing pierced him like a spear. Not for her body, though his flesh burned, but for the chance to belong. To her. To that moment. To something greater than himself. He saw her frown, confused. "I must be dreaming," she whispered before closing her eyes again, and curling against his chest, so close he could feel the pulse of her life beating against his skin. Aodhgall remained still, torn by temptation and bound by honor. He knew their bodies were fire for each other, but she was still weak, unaware of her own will. She was not his to take, and wouldn't be unless she chose him freely. With fingers trembling from the struggle within, he caressed her back, feeling the delicacy of her skin, the soft curve of her hip, and forced himself to stop. He couldn't. He mustn't. Even if every part of him screamed to claim her, like a warrior after victory. With a soft groan he pulled away. He couldn't be at her side when she woke, his presence would only bring more pain. He dressed in silence, fastening the tartan with the chief's crest over his shoulder like armor against his own heart. Then he turned to her once more. He looked at her the way one looks at an omen, with fear, longing and reverence, and bent down to kiss her, barely brushing his lips against hers. "Rest, Mocrithi," he whispered. Dawn light filtered golden fingers through the narrow window, painting the stone with honey tones. Dòrnait woke slowly, like a flower opening after a storm. A gentle warmth surrounded her, and for an instant she felt safe, as if the world were nothing more than a kind whisper. She breathed in deeply. The air smelled of myrtle, peat smoke, and something else, a scent that spoke of home, though she couldn't say why. She opened her eyes. The place felt both familiar and strange. It wasn't her room. The bed was larger, the furniture rougher, yet bearing an austere dignity that spoke of ancient lineage. A large chair stood before the nearly dead fire, and a cabinet carved with Celtic knots flanked the wall. Everything was silent, except for the faint murmur of the distant sea, like an endless psalm of penance and rebirth. She tried to sit up, but a dull ache in her back stopped her. Her throat was dry, her lips cracked, her skin as raw as if she'd been dragged over the cliffside rocks. She didn't understand why she was there, or how much had changed while she slept. Chapter 21. At the crossroads of honor and destiny. The door closed with a soft whisper, as if even the wood knew an uncomfortable truth had just been spoken. Dòrnait remained still for a long while, wrapped in the sheets like a penitent under a mantle of silence. The air in the chamber, heavy with ancient stone and peat smoke, seemed to still hold the warmth of bodies and unspoken words. The faint glow of dawn filtering through the narrow window cast shapes on the wall, trembling shadows like the wandering spirits that, according to the island's legends, roamed the castle towers in search of redemption. On the horizon beyond the misted glass, the grey sea struck the cliffs with restrained fury, as if it too carried an unnamed conflict within. Dòrnait sat up slowly on the bed, wrapping herself in the shirt Ceannfhionn had left her, as if it were a ritual tunic woven between the world of the living and that of dreams. The soft linen against her skin reminded her she was still alive, though she felt split in two, between the girl she had been and the woman now gazing through that window, witness to a night she still could not fully understand. Her fingers touched the hollow of her collarbone, where a pendant used to rest. It was gone. A Celtic oak cross, inherited from her mother, carved with endless knots speaking of eternal returns and bonds that could not be broken. That emptiness shook her more than the cold. She tried to remember. Not clearly, that was impossible, but like one groping in a dark cave, guided only by the echo of what had been felt. There had been warmth, a firm embrace, the slow pulse of a man's heart that was not her own. It was not an invasion. It was something more confusing, as if her body in its weakness had recognized a refuge. An ancestral call. As if souls met before reason could name what was happening. And yet now what she felt was shame. Not for the act itself, but for the nakedness of having been seen. For the modesty of having been cared for. For knowing she was desired, and not being able to desire without guilt. Ceannfhionn's words echoed inside her like inverted psalms. When he tires of chasing what he cannot have, I will be waiting. That veiled threat pierced her deeply, not out of jealousy, though perhaps that too, but for the way it pointed to a harsh truth. Aodhgall MacCraith was a man who took what the world denied him. And she was now part of his spoils or his penance. Was that what he sought? Redemption or punishment? An alliance of convenience, as her cousin hinted, or something darker, more intimate, more inevitable? Dòrnait pressed her forehead against the cold glass. Outside, a flock of crows cut across the low sky. One landed on the highest battlement of the castle. The bird turned its head toward her, its eyes like two glowing coals in the mist. For a second she thought it was not a crow, but the Morrigan, the goddess of war and fate, watching over the ties yet to be bound. No, Dòrnait whispered firmly, as if answering that gaze. Fate, Aodhgall, the sharp-voiced woman who had examined her like a relic fallen from an altar. She returned to the bed, pulling the covers up to her neck, not from cold but from stubbornness. She owed that man nothing, she told herself. Not a smile, not a promise, and certainly not a future. But as she closed her eyes, her mind refused to obey. An image clear as the reflection in the waters of a sacred lake rose in her consciousness. Aodhgall's face, bent over her with unexpected tenderness, his lips brushing hers like an unspoken prayer. I know, she had said before Ceannfhionn left. She knew. And yet she could not stop fearing it. She could not stop wanting it. Chapter 22. Ceannfhionn's punch was as strong as her warning, and it wasn't until the next day that Dòrnait managed to sit up in bed, still weak but clear-headed enough to realize that Celia's had not left her side for a single moment. The first thing she asked for was hot water. The salt and cold of the sea had left her skin irritated, stinging like nettles, and she needed to shed that layer of memories. When the lavender steam began to wrap around her body, she felt at times like a different person. She had eaten a bit of oat bread, dressed in the simple woolen clothes that had mysteriously appeared on her dresser while she slept, and for a moment, a brief and deceptive moment, she believed she had regained her old clarity. But not completely. The scented water had not washed away the shadows. She was still the woman who had lain naked beside a man. Although the details slipped away like mist through her fingers, the weight of the memory was real. Aodhgall had saved her. There was no doubt about that. And for that she owed him more than words. She rested her fingers on the stone windowsill, as the sea breeze gently tangled her damp hair. From her window the strait looked narrow, calm and treacherous, like a mirror that lied. The island of Aodhgall seemed just a step away, floating in the mist like an unkept promise. How had everything twisted so far? No one had come to see her. Neither the lord of the castle nor her sisters. That absence weighed heavier than she wanted to admit. And though she had been his prisoner, and had the right to escape, she felt, absurd as the idea was, that she had betrayed something by trying. She sighed, turning away from the window. Her confusion was a whirlwind that refused rest. Yes, Aodhgall had kidnapped her, but he had also looked at her with a tenderness no man had ever offered. His presence, his strength, his stubbornness, they disarmed her. He held over her a power difficult to name. And yet, she had to face him. She had to thank him. She left the room expecting to find Alistair at his post. The corridor, however, was deserted. The torches flickered in the silence, casting long shadows on the cold stone. Strangely uneasy, Dòrnait descended cautiously. The first stretch was easy, but soon her legs gave out. A sudden dizziness forced her to lean against the wall, breathing deeply to avoid collapsing. When she reached the great hall, it was the silence that struck her. Not a trace remained of the usual bustle. The voices, the music, the clatter of dishes and footsteps, all had vanished. She saw some servants pass by, but they quickly averted their gaze as if eye contact burned. Then she saw him. In the courtyard, beneath the pearly grey sky of the highlands, all the men of the castle were lined up before their leader. Aodhgall was speaking, his deep voice demanding silence and obedience. Although Dòrnait caught only the last words, serious offense, vulnerability, dungeons, they were enough to understand. He was punishing them. Because of her. The stab of guilt was sharp. Now she understood what Celia's had told her about clan honor. For a Highland warrior, there was no greater shame than public reprimand before his chief. But the dungeons. She shuddered. She had not expected such severe consequences. She had never seen him like this, so harsh, so unyielding. He was the chief. Like the old Celtic kings, bearer of absolute power in his territory. And that power could crush her if he wished. He could marry her by force, lock her up, humiliate her, and no one would lift a finger. Her only defense was the nobility with which he chose to wield his authority. Then he saw her. From the courtyard he looked up, and found her at the top of the stairs. Dòrnait felt heat rush to her face. She remembered every moment. The instant she spotted him among the waves. The strength with which he swam toward her. The certainty in his voice amid the shipwreck. The promise of salvation, like a dark angel in the waters. And then the warmth of his body beside hers, his skin against hers, the certainty of being alive only because he held her. She remembered everything. The desire. The tenderness. The masculine body that wrapped around her like a shield, like a prayer made flesh. When Aodhgall finished with his men, he crossed the courtyard with long, furious strides. Dòrnait stepped back. She didn't know if he intended to punish her as well. Go back to your... He stopped, softening his tone. You shouldn't have gotten up yet. She raised an eyebrow. The wolf still didn't know how to roar without ordering. I feel better, she said. But he took her by the shoulder and led her inside the castle without answering. Dòrnait tried to pull away when they reached the great hall. I'm fine, really. He looked at her seriously. His concern was palpable, warm like a cloak. You almost died, Dòrnait. You need to rest. For a moment, she wanted to let herself be wrapped in that concern. But she didn't stop. I need to talk to you, she said quietly. He nodded and led her to his private room behind the hall. The room was silent, the fireplace still cold. Dòrnait pushed away the memories the place stirred in her. I heard what you said outside. She hesitated. Is it really necessary to imprison them? They didn't expect me to leave. He closed the door slowly and turned to her, his eyes dark as the waters of Lake Druidneach in winter. Does it seem too barbaric to you? She shook her head, immediately. No, I just wanted to understand. Standing guard is vital. Their mistake was serious. 2 days in the dungeons is less harsh than lashes. But there must be consequences. Dòrnait lowered her gaze. He was right. And yet... Are you going to punish me too? Aodhgall looked surprised. He glanced toward the cold fireplace, his shoulders tense. I think you've already suffered enough punishment. His voice carried a shadow. Something that struck Dòrnait in the chest like a bell toll. She stepped closer, resting a hand on his arm. Thank you, she murmured. For saving me. And for taking care of me afterward. He smiled faintly, the hardness of his face softened by unexpected tenderness. It wasn't a sacrifice. Though I didn't expect you to thank me. She dropped her eyes. I don't remember what happened, she lied, but I'm not foolish enough to prefer death over dignity. Aodhgall's gaze flared, but he said nothing. Dòrnait felt her body respond to the memory, to the latent desire between them. A single gesture, a touch would be enough. Why did you run? He finally asked. Why were you so desperate to get away from me? Because you wouldn't let me leave. I couldn't let you go. Their eyes met. For the first time without masks. Why? She asked, almost breathless. Aodhgall paused. Then, without looking away, he placed his rough hand on her cheek. Because I care about you, girl. His thumb traced a gentle line under her chin. And in that touch, the fragility of the world trembled. She knew it, but hearing it changed everything. She didn't yet understand the reasons for that elaborate subterfuge, or why he wanted to marry her, but it was clear he cared. Realizing this unleashed a wave of unexpected burning, fierce happiness in her chest. I couldn't risk losing you, he concluded, with a vulnerability that disarmed him. Dòrnait leaned toward him, until only a breeze separated their bodies. She breathed in the warm, earthy scent that surrounded him, as intoxicating as the twilight slipping behind the castle walls. And despite everything, she couldn't stop feeling the weight of invisible chains still holding her. You won't. But I could never be with you as your prisoner. Then Aodhgall finally understood. She hadn't rejected him, she was rebelling against her captivity. By abducting her, he hadn't just stolen her freedom, but also her dignity, her sense of control over her own fate. He had to set her free. The price could be high. He could lose her, lose everything. And yet he knew that if he truly wanted her, he had to take the risk. He placed his hands on her shoulders and stepped back. The contact burned on his skin, and her scent clouded his mind. He just wanted to hold her, to seal with kisses all that they hadn't yet said. But that would be a betrayal of the moment. He rested his hands on her waist, a restrained gesture, and locked eyes with her with the intensity of someone about to leap into the void. Very well. You may leave. Dòrnait stifled a scream, covering her mouth with her hand. Are you serious? I'm not your prisoner anymore? I will order my men not to stop you. It was then he was surprised. She threw herself at him, and wrapped her arms around his neck in an embrace full of relief and tenderness. Thank you. You don't know how much this means to me. He smiled, a mix of regret and hope. I can imagine. She looked at him with a spark of curiosity in her eyes. Do you want me to leave? Aodhgall felt the almost physical urge to close his eyes and beg her not to. How could she still not understand? Hadn't he already shown her how much he desired her? He wrapped his arms around her waist and pulled her close. Every curve of her body fit like a recurring memory. That way of belonging to him, of tempting him, inhabiting him, was a longing that burned him up. I want you to stay, he said softly, but as my guest. She raised her eyes, hesitant. How could she imagine she'd want to stay with the man who had kidnapped her? And yet she did. Dòrnait smiled at him, with a sweetness that scraped his soul. Happiness flickered in her gaze like light on water. She left him speechless. I would like that too. Relief mingled with desire, and she couldn't resist. She lowered her head and kissed him, with a care that felt like prayer. It wasn't a kiss of possession, but of reverence. His mouth tasted of flowers, of a summer she didn't want to end. He kissed her deeper, with urgency tempered by tenderness, exploring with devotion born from the depths of his soul. She clung to him, but her legs gave out. Aodhgall cursed under his breath and pulled away sharply. You're not well. You should rest. Before she could protest, he lifted her in his arms and carried her up the stairs. Dòrnait rested her head on his shoulder with a sigh that disarmed him. He carefully laid her down on the bed, tempted to stay by her side. The hardest part was knowing she wouldn't reject him. That she would accept him. And for that very reason, he had to wait. He arranged a pillow and kissed her gently on the forehead. Rest. I'll ask Cilias to come see you later. She nodded, but unease returned to her face. Are Roisiel and Uranie very angry? He shook his head. No. But I think they were a bit disappointed, because you didn't say goodbye. I was going to send for them. He wouldn't have allowed them to leave just like that, but knowing Dòrnait genuinely cared about them touched a deep chord in him. Have you reconsidered about Roisiel? My decision hasn't changed, she replied, frowning. Why would it? Dòrnait blushed. You said you cared. I thought maybe you had understood that. That doesn't change anything. Neither for Roisiel, nor for him, she thought bitterly. Duty was above all. But Dòrnait didn't see it that way. Maybe because she didn't know what it meant to carry a legacy. Maybe because her lineage was more fleeting, freer. Please, she whispered. Couldn't you at least reconsider? As a gesture of goodwill. Aodhgall tensed. Don't ask me to choose between you and my duty as chief. The warning sounded as much for himself as for her. I'm not asking that. I just want you to reconsider. I don't think that contradicts your duty. Aodhgall clenched his jaw. He would grant her that. But she would have to grant him something in return. All right. I'll reconsider. He smiled, then added, but on one condition. Chapter 23. The Pond of Sighs. Only a few days had passed since Dòrnait had accepted, with a mix of unease and curiosity, to stay as a guest of her former captor. Now, riding beside him along tangled paths of heather and fern, she felt the sting of regret. Maybe she should never have said yes. Maybe she should have returned to the withered safety of Edinburgh, where her relatives, attentive yet coercive, would have soon found a suitable husband for her. But she hadn't. And although she told herself her decision had been made in a state of confusion of body, soul, lineage, and fate, she knew that wasn't the whole truth. The ruin she had left behind, the crumbling fortress on the inland sea coast, could not compare to the uncertain yet warm home now opening before her at Dunsagothan. There, among the living stones of the castle and the laughter of her sisters, she had found something she hadn't known how to name until then: belonging. The sea wind, tasting of salt and legend, brought to her mind the face of her mother, who once ruled her own castle with stern dignity. Dòrnait had never been able to touch the walls of that place with the freedom she now walked through the halls of Dunsagothan. Perhaps that was why the thought of leaving hurt so much. Perhaps that was why she had stayed. But then he had deceived her. With one condition. Only one, he told her, and she should have guessed. Beside her, Aodhgall rode with enviable calm. His hair, golden like sunlight filtering through a Scottish afternoon's clouds, gleamed as they passed among oaks, willows, and resinous pines. The sky, a perfect blue, stretched like a sacred vault over the hills. He smiled. For him, it was a perfect day to swim. Dòrnait didn't share his enthusiasm. Her face mixed caution with growing impatience. "Come on, girl," he said, as if he could dispel her doubts with a snap of the wind. "You promised. And you said that you catch more bees with honey." She slowly turned her head like a cat tired of games. "That wasn't an invitation to blackmail." "You wouldn't have done it any other way," he admitted without shame. "And it won't be so bad. The water is shallow, and I'll be with you. It's more of a pond than a lake, hidden beneath the trees. No one will see you." "You will," she replied with a frankness that disarmed him. And he, though he tried to feign innocence, burned inside with the image of her trembling, wet, barely covered by fine linen. Teaching her to swim suddenly seemed a noble cause, with a very human reward. "I'm harmless," he murmured. She snorted, not bothering to hide her disdain. They rode in silence, while he pondered the question that had lingered in his mind for days. "Why did you never learn?" Dòrnait lowered her gaze, and when she answered, her voice held the weight of an ancient bell. She spoke of Inverary, of her motherless childhood, of loneliness, of the burning desire to be accepted among older, distant siblings, of how twice she had nearly drowned. Twice the water had tried to claim her. Since then she avoided the sea, rivers, lakes, everything that flowed or stretched without limits. A difficult decision to maintain in the Highlands, land of wild rivers and jagged tidal coasts. Aodhgall listened silently, picturing her as a small, soaked, trembling child no one had rescued. He then understood many things. He also understood why she refused to go to Rùm or Aodhgall, where the sea ruled every path. "But you didn't seem nervous when we came to Dunsagothan," he remarked. "And the sea was rough." She hesitated. A faint blush rose in her cheeks. "I guess I was more worried about having been kidnapped." "You were never in danger." "I didn't know that then." After a pause, "I'm not sure I know it now." The confession hurt him more than he wanted to admit. Dòrnait spoke honestly. The fear she felt was stronger than her pride. She described it in detail, the stiffness of her body, the pounding pulse, the mind clouding like a stormy sky. Aodhgall recognized the symptoms. It was the same terror he had seen in men's eyes caught by panic in battle. "Clinging to that fear only makes it stronger," he said gently, without condescension. "You're not a coward, Dòrnait. I know that. Learning to swim won't make you invincible. But it will make you free." She nodded, though without conviction. The grove appeared over the hill like a revelation. The breeze grew cooler there, scented by the dampness of leaves and nearby waters. The lake lay asleep in a hollow, hidden from the world. It was a round pond, surrounded by dark rocks and silver lichens, fed by a babbling stream descending from the hills. The waters were so clear that the reflection of the reeds looked like real things in another world. Dòrnait held her breath. "It's beautiful. What's it called?" "The Pool of Sighs." She didn't laugh. She nodded solemnly. "The name suits it. It feels like it's from another world." Aodhgall's pride flared. For her, a flower of courts and distant castles, To recognize the magic of his lands meant almost a sacred honor to him. He spread a blanket on the grass with bread, cheese, and claret. They ate in silence, surrounded by the murmur of the stream, the distant song of a lark, the whisper of the trees like a prayer. Sunlight filtered through the branches, drawing gold on Dòrnait's pale skin as she held the bottle to her lips longer than necessary. Aodhgall, reclining on his tartan, watched her as if she were a poem. Then he sat up and offered her his hand. "Are you ready?" She looked at him, her eyes green like moss lit by the light. "I haven't finished. Delaying it won't make it easier. Look around you. What could go wrong in a place like this?" And though Dòrnait's heart still raced, the magic of the place and of him was finally beginning to calm her storms. Dòrnait thought of saying many things, words sharp as thorns, but instead she held her breath and placed her cold hand over his. The rough warmth of Aodhgall's skin gave her an immediate strength, like an ancient fire. A fire that didn't burn but supported. She trusted him. She couldn't deny it. She trusted him enough to face the water, that old enemy, and look her demons in the eye. He helped her stand, and with a slight nod of his chin, he pointed to a large solitary rock near the stream's mouth, like a natural altar consecrated to the ritual about to happen. "You can change there," he said in a practical, almost gentle tone. Dòrnait obeyed, walking slowly over the bed of damp grass, where purple thistles and ferns swayed their arms as if blessing her steps. She took shelter behind the stone, and each fold of clothing she removed seemed to strip away a layer of protection. Her fingers, clumsy and stiff with cold and anxiety, struggled to unfasten the corset borrowed from Roisiel. She was thankful she could take it off alone. She wouldn't have borne Aodhgall's touch then, not from modesty but because her nerves were so raw that any contact would have broken her. But it wasn't just the water that terrified her. It was him. Something new had arisen between them, something intimate and stealthy like a deer in the mist. He was no longer her captor but something more uncertain and more fearsome, her possibility. With a single gesture he had opened a door to another world, a world where freedom and desire walked hand in hand. Aodhgall cleared his throat, on the other side of the rock. The murmur of the stream wasn't enough to hide his impatience. Just when it seemed he might come to fetch her, Dòrnait emerged upright and trembling. She wore a linen shirt and wool trousers cut just below the knees. She hugged herself, as if trying to hold on to the warmth the fabric no longer offered. "Echan borrowed it from your squire," she explained without looking up. He examined her from head to toe. His gaze paused for a moment on her breasts hugged by the wet fabric, on her well-shaped hips, and on the bare feet that touched the earth as if they had never felt it before. For a moment, passion flashed through his eyes like lightning in a cloudy sky, then faded into a stifled laugh. "These clothes, they don't look like the same ones on you." She blushed, suddenly feeling transparent, exposed. But she didn't shrink back. Because she was looking at him too. He was barefoot, his trousers low on his hips, his torso bare, bronzed by the Highland sun. His body was a symphony of strength, as if each muscle had been sculpted by a Celtic god, and blessed by St. Columba's dew. Dòrnait felt a rush of heat, so powerful it almost made her forget the water. "It seems so cold," she murmured, rubbing her hands. "It's one of the hottest days of the year." "The water will be as warm as a tub by the fire," he replied calmly. "Everything will be fine. Come on, girl. Let's not delay it any longer." His voice was firm but sweet as a whispered psalm among ruins. She had no will to resist. She took his hand. The path to the shore was stone and moss. Each step felt heavy, as if she were walking on the bed of an enchanted river where the stones judge those who tread on them. Noticing her hesitation, Aodhgall gently squeezed her fingers, like an anchor that doesn't imprison but holds. When they reached the water, the world seemed to fall silent. There was no wind. Only the distant song of a lark and the murmur of the current, which seemed to say "Fear not" in the language of the soul. "Breathe, girl. Slowly." She shook her head. Terror closed her chest like a helmet. It was what she had described so many times, water as an abyss, darkness, suffocation. I don't think I can do it, she stammered, trembling. The holy rude beast admitting defeat, he smiled mischievously. The girl who climbed walls afraid of a lake? She shot him an irritated look, frowning. She knew what he was doing. And for a moment she almost laughed. Almost. Until she looked at the water again. Don't look at the water. Look at me. She raised her eyes. They were his, blue, steady, protective. Like the sky of Iona, after the storm. That look was a promise. Her heart slowed. She breathed. And allowed him to guide her out into the sea. The first touch of the water on her feet was like an icy blade. She shivered. He began to speak in Erse, that ancient tongue as old as the stones, and his words were like healing songs. They moved forward. The water rose to their waists. Dòrnait felt every muscle in her body scream with fear, but the warmth of Aodhgall's chest against her back was a fortress. You're doing very well, Mowgri. She didn't believe it. But she was there. I'm going to take you a little deeper. Ready? Isn't this enough? We won't go very deep. I've got you in my arms. You won't sink. He knelt and held her so her body floated. The water licked her shoulders. She began to tremble. Dark memories stirred, of water swallowing her, of absent light, of a world without oxygen. Fear overwhelmed her. She struggled. Tried to rise. Let me go, she gasped. Shush. I've got you. You're safe. His words were oil on turbulent waters. She clung to his shoulders and buried her face in his neck. She was shaking, but he was rock and anchor, warm, unmoving. He caressed her tenderly, from shoulder to side, from back to hips. Calm returned, slow and warm like a receding tide. The water ceased to be an enemy. It became weightless, almost welcoming. Like a cloud. Like a womb. The attraction between them was another wave. Irresistible. The wet fabric of the shirt was barely a veil over her skin. Desire was palpable, his and hers. Better, he whispered in her ear. She nodded. She no longer trembled. She was alive in a different way, aflame. Yes. Your method isn't orthodox. But effective, she smiled, brushing her lips lightly against his. She felt his erection pressing against her. A revelation that didn't scare her. He was burning too. And dangerous. Yes, Aodhgall admitted. Very dangerous. Dòrnait pulled slightly away, her eyes shining. And now? He looked at her with that mixture of promise and threat, the same look that will-o'-the-wisps have on the edge of swamps. Now, alone. Tilt your face. To the chin, then the nose. Close your mouth and breathe through your nose. Watch. He did it in front of her, calmly. Dòrnait wanted to refuse. But she knew he was right. If she didn't, fear would always rule her soul. She tried. Once. Twice. Thrice. Each time panic pushed her away. He held her hands. Murmured words of encouragement. It wasn't enough. She looked at him, distressed. I can't. He lifted her chin gently. Your fear won't vanish in a day. But you've already made huge steps. Have I disappointed you? She whispered. I'm not a good student. He smiled, that smile that could set a church on fire. On the contrary. I'm looking forward to giving you more lessons. And as his hand traveled down her hips, she understood the true abyss was not in the water. It was in him. The sea licked the shore like a patient lover. The waves, gentle and ancient, carried the whisper of forgotten legends. In the clearing between the cliffs, where the forest surrendered its voice to the ocean, Dòrnait stood suspended between desire and doubt, between flesh and spirit. The water wrapped around their bodies like a veil of profane baptism, warm and mysterious beneath the trembling light of clouds beginning to tear over the dusk. "What are you thinking?" she murmured, her voice barely louder than the breeze. "Of another distraction, one more beautiful than the song of the sylphs," Aodhgall replied, his deep voice vibrating like an ancient prayer. His gaze did not seek her body but her soul. Yet his hands, tempered by the blood of generations of warriors, brushed reverently along the curve of her waist, sliding like a blessing toward her breasts without touching, only announcing. Dòrnait shivered, not from the cold water, but from the incendiary anticipation that curled beneath her skin like a sacred flame. "Focus on my mouth," he asked, with that quiet firmness that made the world around them vanish. She nodded, silent, possessed by the spell of that moment. Their lips met in a kiss slow and deep, as if recognizing each other from another life. He gently submerged her in the water, wrapping her in that baptism of passion. Then he lifted her, as if she were being born anew. "I did it," she gasped, laughing from the soul. "You did well," he said with a smile that seemed to light the mist. "Soon you'll swim like a mighty MacCuinn, a maiden of the waves." His words echoed the old stories, the ones that told of water spirits taking human form to love, and then vanishing with the tide. Dòrnait felt that for an instant she too was one of them, daughter of the sea and of desire. He held her so their bodies were face to face, skin to skin, desire made manifest. When his thumb brushed her breast, it was as if the entire world contracted into that one gesture. She moaned softly, like a dove song at dawn. Her thoughts were flames, her will ashes. "A kiss," he said, so close their breaths mingled. "You can thank me with a kiss." But Dòrnait knew a kiss wouldn't be enough. Her body ached for the consummation of everything that had burned between them, since the beginning. She had never thought of her virginity as an altar, but as a frontier. And now, standing before him, her body shining under the shifting sky, she knew she was ready to cross it. She kissed him, the way creatures do when they've never known fear. Her mouth, soft at first, explored his with a boldness guided more by instinct than experience. She rubbed against him, her hips tracing the ancestral dance of desire, her breasts trembling against his chest like wings in a storm. Aodhgall remained motionless, like a statue carved from living stone. But Dòrnait could feel the wild beating of his heart. The tension between them was a taut cord on the verge of snapping. "Will this be enough?" she whispered, looking into his eyes. He swallowed, his jaw clenched as if waging a battle within himself. "Yes, this is enough," he said, his voice rough and broken. But it wasn't. Her hand moved between them, bold and steady, and touched him. He muttered a curse, and the water seemed to warm around their bodies. When her fingers closed fully around him, Dòrnait felt a strange blend of power and vulnerability. It was like touching fire without burning. Like summoning thunder and hearing it answer. Then he pulled her to him and kissed her, as if time had run out. His mouth claimed hers, not with violence, but with an intensity that overflowed centuries of waiting. She melted into that kiss, into that moment that carried the weight of a Celtic vow. His beard scraped her neck as his hands moved over her, memorizing every curve. She gave herself, burned, dissolved. The world had shrunk to their two bodies dancing in water, blessed by sea gods and forgotten saints. When his lips moved down to her breasts and worshipped them with kisses and caresses that felt like prayers, Dòrnait stopped thinking. She only felt. Aodhgall's mouth stole her sanity, and she pressed against him in desperation, seeking the release only their union could offer. She wanted to feel him inside her, not just as flesh but as soul. As prophecy. As destiny. And in that hidden corner of the world among moss-covered stones and the murmur of the ocean, desire took shape, and two beings found each other in the dark, not for pleasure, but for sacred need. Love, in its most primal and divine form, ignited beneath the rain of salt and promise. Chapter 24. The world seemed to fall silent around them, as if even the forest, the water, and the wind had bowed before the weight of that moment. Aodhgall looked at her as though she were an apparition, her body bathed in the golden light of the afternoon sun, her damp hair spread like an offering over the tartan, and those eyes, those blue eyes like the sea of his childhood now gazing at him without fear. There was nothing more sacred. And there was no place on earth he would rather be than there, between her sighs and the western breeze. He kissed her with a tenderness so deep it seemed to stop time. His breath mingled with hers, and their caresses became a prayer. With every brush of his lips against her skin, with every reverent touch of his hands, he promised her more than pleasure. He offered belonging, care, eternity. When he finally positioned himself between her thighs, he felt not just her body, but her entire soul tremble with desire and fear. She welcomed him with a soft shiver, a sigh rising from the very center of her being. Aodhgall looked into her eyes. "Trust me, MacCraith," he whispered. "There's no pain I wouldn't bear for you." He entered her with devout slowness, as if walking across a fragile bridge into an unknown world. Dòrnait felt him like a deep tide surging through her body, an ancient fire awakening her dormant core. It hurt. Yes. But stronger than the pain was the shock to her soul, the certainty that she was opening herself completely to a new and unrepeatable fate. And then, as he stilled inside her, trembling against her body, he kissed her with the gentleness of a man asking forgiveness for crossing a door with no return. The pain faded, as if love itself had washed it away. The rhythm that followed was unhurried, like a dance of resurrection. Each movement was a beat that wove their bodies into one. Dòrnait closed her eyes and let her breath blend with his. They moved as if guided by a music only they could hear, the echo of centuries of love and loss, of longing and loyalty. She felt protected, loved, revered, but also awake, lit from within as never before. And when her body began to seek his, when her hips answered his, when her lips called for him with renewed hunger, Aodhgall surrendered to the spell. "Mograd," he moaned against her neck. "You are my beginning and my end." She clung to him with all her strength, because she no longer wanted to hold anything back. She wanted to lose herself in him, in that sacred passion that filled her, that wrapped around her, that lifted her beyond the physical. It was as if the whole universe was breathing with them. And when they reached the peak together, when the climax tore through them like lightning in the heart of a storm, their bodies fused in a shudder that was not only physical but profoundly spiritual. Dòrnait wept. Not from pain but from beauty. Because she had never felt anything so vast, so intimate, and so eternal. Aodhgall held her for a long time afterward, still inside her, as if with his warmth he could seal the pact they had just forged. There were no more words. Only the murmur of water, the caress of the breeze, and the certainty that from that day on their destinies were bound forever. The trial by fire. The distant sound of the waves filtered through the cracks in the stone cabin like an ancient litany. The sea roared beyond the heather-covered cliffs, with that deep voice the ocean has when it keeps secrets. Inside, the soft twilight was tinged with the golden light of dusk, falling over the intertwined bodies of Dòrnait and Aodhgall like an ancient blessing, or perhaps a portent. He lifted a lock of her hair, holding it between his fingers with reverence. The touch awakened a sudden shyness in Dòrnait, her face flushed scarlet. She dared not look at him. She felt naked not just in her body, but in her soul. "We will marry as soon as the banns are read," he said, with the ease of someone making an irrevocable decision. Dòrnait looked up, bewildered. Her voice emerged as an incredulous murmur. "What are you talking about?" Aodhgall propped himself up with one arm on the blanket. A dark lock fell across his forehead. For a moment, his battle-hardened face softened, and she felt something tighten within her chest. He was dangerously handsome. But that beauty was as sharp as a Celtic sword, tempting, yes, but not without a price. "Our marriage," he replied in a low voice. "It's understood." The blood pounded in her ears, as she recalled the words he had spoken just moments earlier. Could it be that he had assumed she accepted? He seemed to notice her doubt. "The truth is, I haven't even proposed to you yet," he said. He took her hand in his and kissed it with a tenderness that surprised her. "Dòrnait MacCuinn, would you do me the honor of becoming my wife?" A sharp pang of joy, pure and cruel, pierced her chest. For a moment she felt ready, almost happy. The rough Highlander, who looked at her as if the whole world didn't exist beyond her, didn't resemble the husband of her childhood dreams at all. And yet he was real. But why did he want to marry her? Her mother's warnings echoed like funeral bells in her mind. And the memory of Lord Finlage, like a persistent shadow, forced her to keep her guard up. She swallowed hard. I don't know what to say. A yes would be the proper answer, he said in a calm tone, though his stillness had a tense edge to it, like the frozen surface of a lake hiding treacherous currents. She searched his face for some sign, some crack through which to glimpse his thoughts. Nothing. Just the haughty silence of a man who expects surrender, but does not beg. Why is marriage so important to you? Because I've taken you, and now you belong to me as much as I belong to you, he answered bluntly. His words weren't what she wanted to hear. No promise of love, no pleading of the soul. Just duty. A debt of honor. As if her body were a currency, to be exchanged on the altar of decency. You don't have to marry me for that, she said, forcing a smile that was pure cold iron. He frowned, anger flickered in his sapphire gaze. My honor demands it. Honor, she repeated silently, like a prayer that turns into a sentence. Is that the only reason, she asked slowly. He closed his eyes. A shadow of hesitation crossed his brow. I told you I care about you, he said, brushing her chin gently. But Dòrnait turned her face away. It wasn't enough. Not when her heart trembled like a leaf in a storm. There was an abyss between what she felt and what he said. No, she whispered, her voice cutting the air like a blade. I won't marry you. Disbelief turned to fury. Aodhgall straightened, muscles taut like a drawn bow. You said you would. No. I said I understood the consequences. And I do. You gave yourself to me. You're tarnished now, he spat, his eyes blazing. She trembled but didn't back down. I don't believe that would stop someone from loving me. And if it would, I don't care. Pain flickered across his face. Then the mask of ice returned. Did you use me, Dòrnait? Was that your plan all along? She shook her head. No more than you used me. Aodhgall stood frozen, caught in silence. For a moment, it seemed his soul drained through his eyes. But then, as if something sacred burned inside her, she cupped his face in her hands and kissed him softly. I don't want this misunderstanding to stain what we shared. I gave myself to you knowing exactly what I was doing, and I'd do it again if you asked me to. He looked at her, torn between desire and rage. Making love to Dòrnait had felt like touching the very heart of the earth, deep, ancient, as if their bodies had been searching for each other since before time. He traced a finger along her neck, down to her chest. She shivered. No one else will touch you like this, make you feel like this, he whispered. She closed her eyes when his hand found the center of her body again. But this time, he stopped before the pleasure could break loose. I won't touch you again, he said hoarsely, until you agree to marry me. Dòrnait's eyes flew open, glittering with fury and longing. That was a trap. He shrugged. A merciful one. And sweet, if you wanted it to be. She turned away, her blonde hair spilling over the tartan like the veil of a fallen saint. Aodhgall looked at her with hunger. What if you were with child, he asked coldly. Dòrnait flinched. She instinctively covered her bare belly. I hadn't thought of that. If you are, you'll have no choice. I'll marry you, even if I have to drag you to the altar. She looked at him, shaken. She nodded in silence. Aodhgall stood. He dressed without looking at her, and went out to ready the horses. The sea wind struck his face like a baptism of fury. He loved her. Damn it, he loved her. But he didn't know how to say it. When he returned, Dòrnait was dressed. She had gathered the food and folded the tartan with ceremonial hands. As if everything that had happened was a dream, or a sin already confessed. Are you ready? He asked flatly. She nodded. Are you still angry? He wasn't just angry. He was lost. The plan so clear 2 moons ago had become fog and fire. And Dòrnait. Dòrnait was a labyrinth of roses and thorns. As beautiful as she was dangerous. And he no longer knew if he was fighting for her or against himself. Chapter 25. Where the tide meets the soul. Dòrnait's resistance was beginning to crack, like a wall too long battered by salty wind and tides. Aodhgall MacCraith, with the patience of a hunter and the resolve of a Celtic monk carved in stone, never broke his word. Since their return from the Pool of Sighs, he seemed intent on immersing her in a spell more potent than any druidic charm, desire. Each day was a dance on the edge of the abyss. He would appear in the corridor, by a window at the foot of the stairs, his hand brushing hers or his mouth dangerously close to her ear, speaking in a low voice like a forbidden psalm. He never touched her quite enough. Never crossed the line she secretly begged him to cross. And it drove her mad. The memory of his caresses, both real and imagined, was a fire that refused to die. Her mind, against her will, returned to those moments when her body had been claimed, when his mouth had sought her like a soul seeking redemption. He had taken her beyond modesty, beyond reason, to the very threshold of ecstasy. And though her body cried out for that bliss once more, her heart, that wild, stubborn creature, resisted. In the mornings she found relief only in her lessons with Uranie and Roisiel, where she could lose herself in texts and leave behind Aodhgall's intensity. That morning, however, peace had been brief. Her sisters had just left, and she was putting the books away. The stone of the castle breathed with the silence of the hour. From the sea came the deep murmur of waves crashing against the rocks, like an echo of Dòrnait's own heart. As she slid an anthology of songs and sonnets back into place, she felt the warmth of a body behind her. A strong arm, hot like iron forged in the sun, wrapped around her waist. Aodhgall. The scent of heather, damp pine and salt surrounded her before she could even see him. His fingers pressed into her hips, guiding her back to him like branches trapping a willing prey. His hips brushed against her, and with that subtle pressure the world vanished. Aodhgall buried his face in her hair, and kissed her neck with a slow, liturgical reverence. Each touch was an ancient prayer, a summons to the gods of pleasure and torment. Dòrnait closed her eyes, undone. "Did you miss me?" he murmured, his breath melting the skin at her nape. The shiver that ran through her was like a Celtic prophecy. She opened her eyes, breathless. "And no. Liar," he said, stepping back with a smile that could have belonged to a saint or a demon. It took her a few seconds to breathe again, and turn to face him. "What are you doing here?" "You said you wouldn't be," she stammered, trying to compose herself, to pretend indifference. He raised an eyebrow, amused. "Just came to remind you about our lesson tomorrow. Swimming. Another class. Another sweet torment." Dòrnait held back a smile. "I'm looking forward to it." "So am I." The way he said it made her catch her breath. But he wasn't finished. "I've invited my sisters." Seemed prudent. She straightened, trying to look composed. "I'm not afraid to be alone with you." "Of course not," he replied with a soft laugh that disarmed her. "Just cautious, right?" Dòrnait didn't answer. She thought of Roisiel, of the sadness that had veiled her eyes since learning her fate. She made the suggestion gently, measuring her words. "Maybe Coanich could come too." Aodhgall's eyes darkened. She knew instantly, he understood what she was trying to do. "You promised you'd reconsider your decision about Roisiel." He nodded, with the gravity of a Celtic judge. "And I have. And the alliance with Saratharna is vital." "I'm sorry, Dòrnait." She lowered her gaze, struggling not to let disappointment overwhelm her. "I understand," she whispered. But she didn't understand. Or perhaps she didn't want to understand. What kind of honor was this that sacrificed her sister's soul for a treaty? "And you?" He asked then, his voice low. Have you reconsidered? She looked at him, the shadows of the past dancing in her eyes. How can you speak to me of marriage, when you're forcing your sister to marry without love? Aodhgall's expression tightened, but it was only a slight hardening, like a stone resisting the sea's waves. No one is forcing her. Roisil understands the duty. But she shouldn't, Dòrnait said, her voice broken. Not for the clan. Not at that price. Aodhgall looked at her for a long moment. And you, what price are you willing to pay for your clan, Dòrnait? She lifted her chin. I wouldn't marry out of obligation. I wouldn't become a trophy, like my mother was. A shadow crossed his face, like a cloud darkening an altar. It's not your war. Don't make a crusade out of what doesn't concern you. I just want Roisil to have the chance to choose. To be happy. And so do I, he replied more softly. But there's more at stake than feelings. You said you'd think about it. And I did. I didn't promise I'd change my mind. The silence that followed was as thick as the fog rising from the sea. Don't try to manipulate me, Dòrnait. She looked at him, her anger contained. Are you sure it's not the other way around? Aodhgall looked at her as if he wanted to speak, but held himself back. Something in his expression, a fleeting shadow, a tremor, made her pause. Why did you really bring me here? He hesitated. To reclaim my castle. And to marry me. It seemed like a good idea. She narrowed her eyes. Why? Aodhgall shrugged, but his gesture was measured, almost rehearsed. For many reasons. Tell me one. He clenched his jaw. Finally, he spoke with the frankness of a warrior confessing his sins. You're beautiful, wealthy, with influential connections. And you carry a symbol that, for my people, represents the end of a curse that's lasted for 80 years. The amulet. The brooch. The tie to the prophecy. His words were sweet blades, and yet they bled within her. She had asked for the truth. And he had given it to her. Unadorned. Perhaps that was why Aodhgall took her into his arms, with unexpected tenderness. Just because I know your worth as a wife, doesn't mean I don't desire you as a woman. Dòrnait looked at him, searching his face for a reflection of sincerity. And there are no other reasons. But the silence that followed was more eloquent than any words. The silence between them was as dense as the fog that clung to the cliffs in the early hours of dawn. Outside, the wind carried the scent of the sea, briny and fierce, and high atop the castle towers, the stone gargoyles seemed to lean in, listening for the weight of the unspoken truth. Are there more reasons? She asked without raising her voice, as if afraid to frighten something sacred away. Why do you always have to push me? He replied in a dry whisper, nearly a restrained growl. Can't you just leave me be? But it wasn't her he blamed. It was himself. The crossroads he stood at. The vows that weighed heavier than iron. If there was ever a moment to tell her the truth, it was this one. And yet he felt as though he were walking a path of wet peat, where any misstep would drag him into the abyss. Telling her the truth about his deal with Aodhgall could endanger not only his brother, still imprisoned in the dungeons of blackness, but his entire clan. But to lie to her, to lie meant staining the one pure thing that still remained between them. Dòrnait, with eyes bright as moonlit lakes, was more than a desire. She was a test. He knew how much it would hurt her to realize she had been used, even for an honorable cause. That kind of pain cut deeper than any battlefield wound. Because it wasn't a wound of the body, but of the soul. Outside, the gulls circled above the sea, shrieking like Celtic augurs, reminding him that destiny could not be postponed forever. The castle groaned in its foundations, as if the spirits of his ancestors protested the price of human bargains. He had no choice. Aodhgall was his only hope to free Fionn. Blackness Castle wouldn't fall to steel, and he had already sacrificed too many men. Influence was now his only weapon. His only chance. Dòrnait's voice pulled him back into the world of stone and flesh. Why do you deny what's between us? She asked, her words an open wound. Would you rather end up alone than take the risk? It was like she had struck him. He recoiled, not physically but deep within. He felt his resistance begin to fracture. I don't know why you won't speak, she added, her voice trembling. She made to step away, but he caught her arm, not to force her but so he wouldn't lose her entirely. He pulled her close, and the scent of wildflowers that clung to her intoxicated him like a druid's spell. You know what I think, Dòrnait, he whispered, his voice low and burning. I think you're afraid. Afraid to feel. Afraid to let someone close enough to hurt you. Your life has been one long battle like your mother's, but in reverse. Where she submitted, you fight. And you fight so hard you forget the ones who love you. She drew herself up, her eyes blazing. How dare you? I have the right, he said, the growl in his throat barely contained. The moment you were mine, that right was given to me. Not by law or pact, but by what lives between us. What else matters more than that? What I feel for you is real. What you feel is real too. Isn't that enough? It matters to me, she replied softly, her eyes clouded by an inner storm. So vulnerable, so proud. Like a fawn cornered among the trees of an enchanted forest. Aodhgall felt a fierce urge to protect her, to shield her beneath the mantle of his name, his house, his honor. You shouldn't care. I would never hurt you, Dòrnait. Not intentionally. I want to take care of you, protect you. Stay by your side. You know that, don't you? Dòrnait didn't answer. But her breathing quickened, growing uneven, as desire coiled between them like thick ivy. He leaned in toward her neck, drawn by the warmth of her skin, by the unspeakable sweetness of having her so close. Maybe you're overthinking, he whispered, sensing how her body was surrendering, how tension was giving way to longing. But just when the space between them seemed ready to vanish, she pulled away with effort. I have to go, she murmured. Unless you have a reason for me to stay. He hesitated. He was close to telling her the truth, that he was going to investigate rumors about his brother Terbert abusing their people on Rùm, but he couldn't. Not without proof. Not if it meant watching her look at him with suspicion again. I have to tend to my lands. I'll be back tonight, he said at last, stepping away. Aodhgall. He turned, surprised by the gentleness with which she spoke his name. A single word that, in her voice, sounded like a prayer. You haven't answered my question. No, he hadn't. And he wouldn't. But he would give her something. A hint. A veiled promise. He cupped her face in his hands, as if that gesture could preserve the moment. He kissed her with tenderness, a touch barely held in check. The kiss was a confession he didn't dare put into words. You already know what matters. The rest is up to you. You can take the risk or stay locked in the past. And with a final brush of his lips, he stepped away, leaving her there, alone in the sea mist, surrounded by the echoes of a fate yet to be written. Chapter 26. The hall door slammed shut behind Terbert, cutting off the wailing wind that swept down from the cliffs, carrying with it the bitter salt of the sea, as if the very waters themselves were warning of the fire brewing behind the walls of Dunbray. Inside, torches hissed against the damp stone, casting trembling shadows that danced as if sharing in the fury of the castle's lord. Terbert collapsed into the great carved oak chair, his gaze locked on the hearth where a meager fire flickered, powerless to warm the vastness of the room. Outside, the storm brewing over the Sound of Aodhgall raised its voice in an ancient lament, as though the island's forgotten deities were stirring from their slumber. The land itself seemed to reject him. The roar of the waves against the rocks mingled with the muffled prayers drifting from the small chapel in the south tower. An old monk lit candles for souls long unclaimed. But Terbert believed in no salvation. No saints. No fairies or banshees. Only in the blade of steel, and the fear he could draw from men. The Lord's return, Muirena's words still rang in his head like a threat cloaked in the faith of the weak. Even the witch Beithig had spoken of it. They said the bloodline of Rùm was marked by the favor of the Lady of the Sea, the Kaya, mother of storms, guardian of the waters, and that as long as a MacCraith ruled from his stone keep facing the Atlantic, the harvests would survive the lash of the wind and men would find their way beneath the stars. And yet Terbert's star seemed to be fading. His mother dead. Hunger rising. The cattle raided. The people whispering prayers not for him, but against him. "The devil brought you here," Mirena had said. A sentence no amount of claret could wash from his tongue. He stood suddenly, the chair groaning beneath the force. The fire snapped in response, as if echoing his rage. He strode to the narrow window that overlooked the dark waters of the channel. In the distance, the lights of small boats flickered like will-o'-the-wisps. Rùm, he knew the other was near. The rumor that Dòrnait had been abducted was only half the story. The truth was more dangerous. His sister might not have been taken but may have given herself. A bolt of lightning split the sky, revealing for a moment the outline of the cliff and the waves crashing violently at the fortress's base. The thunder followed, like the echo of old gods who did not easily forgive blasphemy. He clenched his jaw. He couldn't allow that marriage. Not while Aodhgall, that two-faced hypocrite, used it as a move to legitimize alliances he didn't understand. Dòrnait was his. Not as a man claims a woman, but as a clan chief claims what is his. And now he was at risk of losing her to the very bastard who had humiliated him in war, stolen his cattle, and who now, if the forest spirits were to be believed, had been marked by the Kaya herself. What if it was true? What if the prophecy wasn't just superstition? He took from a small chest an old braid of leather, once worn by his mother during a ritual by the Druid's well. That amulet, the Critti clock, the Heartstone, was never meant to fall into Dòrnait's hands. If she bore it, she would seal the fate of Rùm, and his own. He lit a new candle, and placed it over the map spread across the table. His finger traced the coast of Aodhgall, where his enemy's castle stood like a sentinel of the past. "I want his head," he murmured. "And I want it soon." Then a figure appeared in the doorway. Mirena. More gaunt than before, but standing tall with the dignity of ancient stones untouched by time or wind. "My lord. Ailey is gone." Terbert stared at her, unmoving. "What do you mean, gone?" "She left with a monk this morning. Said she was going to pray for her sister." "What monk?" "One with a Celtic cross around his neck, and the word Rùm on his tongue." Terbert clenched his fists. This wasn't a war. It was a curse unleashed. But it was also a challenge. And he meant to crush it. The fire crackled louder, as if giving its blessing to the battle to come. Chapter 27. The sun, high and merciful, filtered through ragged clouds like golden fingers from the heavens, caressing the surface of Lochan Nan Sithician, the pool of sighs, with an ancient, almost sacred light. The still water reflected the trembling outlines of oaks and rolling hills covered in heather. It was said that maidens could see their fate there at dusk, when the veil between worlds grew thin. But that day, at the 6th hour, the fairies must have closed their eyes, or perhaps they watched from the reeds, amused by the laughter and noise of the intruders. Dòrnait laughed, barefoot on stones polished by centuries of rain. Roisiel and Uranie were with her, carefree, skirts hiked up and splashing like children. Even the soldiers laughed, swept up in the lightness of the moment. It was a pause between storms, a truce beneath a benevolent sky. Aodhgall watched from the shore, the sun warm on his back, his thoughts divided. Beside him, the earth split into deep roots and small flowers like whispered prayers. He hadn't planned a holiday. His men, newly freed from the jaws of Dun Sagathan, still carried the shadow of captivity in their eyes. But even warriors needed to remember they were human, that they could feel more than pain and duty. Still his mind returned, unrelenting, to what he'd left behind. Bodies scarred by abuse, fields ravaged by rain and greed, the impunity of Terbert. The Campbells were still many, and he barely a lord without a castle. But he had a plan. And a name. For Char MacCuinn, cousin by blood and battle, whose aid could prove decisive. A marriage to Dòrnait would make him an ally, not a ghost. She stepped from the water with the grace of a nymph, her body covered only by a shirt stolen from his men, clinging to her skin with damp transparency. The fabric, thin as morning mist, hid nothing. Aodhgall swallowed, uneasy. His bare chest burned under the sun, but more from her nearness. "What's wrong?" she asked, stepping across the wet stones. "Nothing." He bent to pick up his shirt, trying to redirect the desire and thoughts that clung like nettles inside him. "It's getting late. We should go." Dòrnait stopped him with a light touch, cold as spring water. The pressure of her fingers held more power than any spell. "What happened here?" she asked, brushing the rib where a dark bruise marked his skin, like an ancient Celtic rune. "I noticed before. You watch me that closely." She blushed. "It's hard not to notice something like that," she replied, trying for dignity, though concern still clouded her voice. "You were struck with a sword. Aren't you going to tell me who did it?" He hesitated. The memory of the ambush surged back, the blow from behind, the blade slicing his side, the warm blood. He pressed his lips together. "One of Cradmore's dogs. I was careless. It won't happen again." Dòrnait said nothing. She looked down, her fingers tracing the bruise to his waist. Aodhgall stopped her, his hand closing over hers. The touch sparked fire. She felt it too, her breath shortened, quickened. He made the mistake of looking. The wet fabric left little to the imagination. He remembered her right there among the stones, gasping beneath him, sea salt on her skin, passion burning like a desecrated altar. "You'll have to stop touching me, darling," he said softly, "unless you want us to finish what we started, with an audience we'd best avoid." She looked at him wide-eyed. Then her gaze dropped, lingering on his body. He didn't need more words. "Well." Dòrnait shook her head, her voice barely a whisper. But he went on. "Then take my sisters with you while you change." She nodded and turned away, but halfway down the path she stopped. "Aodhgall, Yes. I'm sorry. I didn't mean to." He smiled, not bitterly. "I know. Go now. The day's fading." He watched her vanish among the ferns, and felt a warm tide rise in his chest. It wasn't desire that moved him most, but something deeper and rarer, the steady weight of knowing someone cared for him. Perhaps, he thought, he could learn to live with that. Maybe even need it. In the distance, a flock of terns rose over the water as if something unseen had startled them. The lake stilled again. Aodhgall lingered a little longer, listening to the far-off heartbeat of the sea, and the echo of fate calling him down paths of stone and blood. The whisper of leaves was the only warning before chaos erupted. That glade, lost among oaks and thorn bushes that arched like ancient hands over the living, suddenly turned into a circle of war. A whistle sliced through the air, and then steel answered, dry, brutal. Dòrnait barely had time to turn before Aodhgall's men burst from the edge of the forest like stalking deer, the fury of the clan carved into their faces. Torrin stepped forward, raising his hands with a calming voice. "Wait. We're not enemies." But no one heard him. Blood spoke louder than words. Malcuth, the first to seize her, clutched his dagger awkwardly, turning toward Dòrnait as if seeking a shield in her body. Aodhgall saw it. His roar tore through the air like thunder crashing down the mountains. The earth trembled beneath his feet as he charged, his face steeled, his eyes blazing like the storm-racked sea. "Let her go." His sword clashed with Malcuth's with a sound that split the morning in two. Dòrnait stumbled back, heart racing, throat ablaze. Echoes of old legends rang in her ears, maidens stolen by dark beings at dusk, in places marked by the city, the hidden folk beneath the hills. Was this glade one of those veiled places where the veil between worlds thins? The air smelled of iron and pitch, but also of something older, something sacred, like incense smoke in an abandoned church. A familiar voice shattered her reverie. Dòrnait. Roisiel, disheveled and pale, emerged from torn branches, dagger in hand. "No!" Dòrnait shouted. Stay back. Too late. An enemy soldier, one who had been hidden in the underbrush, lunged at Roisiel. But Echan threw himself in the way like a wolf guarding its cub. There was a scream, then another. The fight spread like an oil stain. Beside her, Torrin was still trying to explain, gesturing toward Aodhgall. She's MacCraith's sister. We meant no harm. It was a mistake. But Aodhgall wasn't listening anymore. His sword said everything. Every strike was a judgment. Every step a sentence. Dòrnait, panting, turned to the man who claimed to come in her brother's name. Why now? Why like this, she asked, her voice cracked with fury. If Terbert wanted to save me, why send men who kidnap and threaten? Torrin lowered his gaze. I don't know. He ordered us to bring you, no questions. He said you were in danger. That the false MacKinnon had you trapped. The false MacKinnon. A chill slid down Dorna's spine, as if an ancient prophecy was beginning to unfold in scattered fragments. Was this what her mother had feared? Were these the invisible webs the gods wove through the lives of mortals? The clamor of battle faded. The bodies pulled apart. The ground, soaked in blood, looked darker, as if the Scottish earth itself drank from the sacrifice. Aodhgall stopped in front of her, covered in sweat and dust, his gaze still burning with fury but now touched with relief. Are you all right? He asked hoarsely. Dòrnait nodded, trembling. The clash had ended, but the battle in her chest was just beginning, the struggle between past and future, between the blood of her ancestors and the will of her heart. It was Terbert, she said simply. He sent them for me. He thinks I'm still a prisoner. Aodhgall closed his eyes for a moment. Then he opened them, dark and shining like the ocean's depths. Then let him know, he said, you're not anymore. In the distance, above the trees, the mist rose in spirals, as if the pool of sighs were breathing. And the cry of a lone crow tore the sky like an omen.